A bank manager stood in the middle of a crowded lobby, holding a check for $10 million. And then she tore it in half. The sound echoed through the marble hall like a gunshot. But she wasn't finished. She tore it again and again, until the pieces were small enough to crumple in her fist. Then she threw them at the chest of the woman standing before her. A black woman in a faded waitress uniform. The paper scattered across the polished floor. Phones were out, recording everything. A room full of people in expensive suits and designer bags watched in silence. Not one person said a word. The woman in the uniform stood perfectly still, looking down at the torn pieces of her check lying at her worn shoes. Then she looked up and said quietly, "I'm not leaving." What happened next would change everything. Because the woman in that waitress uniform wasn't who anyone thought she was. But let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment she walked through those heavy glass doors. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just past 12:30. Victoria Lane pushed open the entrance to Sterling Trust Bank on Fifth Avenue, and you could almost feel the temperature drop. This wasn't the kind of place where people like her usually came. The lobby was designed to intimidate. Marble floors polished until you could see your reflection. Crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls. Brass fixtures gleaming under soft, expensive light. The people inside matched the decor. Men in tailored suits checking their portfolios. Women with handbags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And then there was Victoria. She was 45 years old, with dark honey-colored skin and hands that told the story of honest work. Her uniform was a faded blue polo shirt with Rosie's Diner stitched above the pocket. The smell of bacon grease and coffee still clung to the fabric from the breakfast rush she'd just finished. Her shoes were practical flats, worn down at the heels. No jewelry. No makeup. Her hair pulled back in a simple bun. She'd come straight from work because the check in her pocket had been waiting long enough. Victoria walked across that marble floor with steady steps. She'd learned a long time ago that buildings were just buildings, no matter how much money they spent on fancy floors and lighting. She'd stood in rooms far more impressive than this one, though nobody here would ever guess it. Behind the counter, a young teller looked up. His name tag said David Chin. He was maybe 25, fresh-faced, clearly new to the job. When he saw her uniform, his professional smile flickered. Just for a second. But Victoria caught it. She always did. His eyes darted to the security guard standing by the door before coming back to her. "Good afternoon," he said, and his voice had that careful politeness people use when they're not quite sure how to talk to you. "How can I help you today?" Victoria reached into her pocket and placed a check on the counter. "I'd like to deposit this into my account." David looked down, and his whole face changed. The check was for $10 million. $10 million. 7 zeros following a 1, issued by a real estate company, made out to Victoria Lane, signed and dated. Everything looked legitimate. Everything was in order. But nothing about the woman standing in front of him matched that number. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the check, holding it like it might disappear if he blinked. He stared at it, then at Victoria, then back at the check. "One moment, please." His voice cracked. "I need to get my manager." Victoria nodded. She'd expected this. 90 seconds later, heels clicked across the marble floor with the precise rhythm of someone who believed every step they took mattered. Patricia Bennett arrived at the counter like a storm in designer clothing. She was 38, blonde, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost $3,000. Real pearls hung around her neck. Not the fake ones. Patricia Bennett would never wear anything fake. She'd been managing this branch for 3 years, and in that time, she'd developed what she thought was a valuable skill. She could look at a person and know, within 10 seconds, exactly what they were worth. The clothes they wore, how they stood, the watch on their wrist, the way they spoke. Patricia could assess someone's bank account before they even opened their mouth. This skill had carried her from a middle-class childhood to a corner office with a view. It had never failed her. Until today. Patricia looked at Victoria. She saw the stained uniform, the worn shoes, the calloused hands. She saw a woman who, by every visible measure, had no business being in this bank, let alone holding a check for $10 million. Then she looked at the check. Her lip curled just slightly. "Ma'am," she said, and the word dripped with condescension, like she was talking to a child who'd wandered into the wrong room. "May I ask where you obtained this check?" "It's payment from a business transaction," Victoria replied, her voice calm. "A real estate sale." Patricia's eyebrow arched. "A real estate sale. I see." She turned the check over in her hands, examining it like she was searching for invisible ink. "And what exactly do you do for a living?" "I'm a waitress." The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, the quiet murmur of the lobby began to fade. Other customers were starting to notice. A man in a three-piece suit lowered his newspaper. A woman with a bag that could have paid Victoria's rent for 6 months whispered something to her companion. Patricia smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. "A waitress," she repeated slowly, "with a $10 million check." "That's correct. I'm going to need to see 2 forms of identification." Victoria pulled out her driver's license and passport. Patricia examined them like a detective looking for forgery, holding them up to the light, comparing the photos to Victoria's face. Everything matched. Everything was legitimate. But Patricia had already made up her mind. "I'm going to need to verify the source of these funds," she announced, her voice rising. Louder than it needed to be. Loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "This is standard procedure for potentially fraudulent transactions." The word fraudulent cut through the air like a knife. Victoria's expression didn't change. "Of course. You can call the issuing bank. The number should be on the check." But Patricia didn't reach for the phone to call the bank. Instead, she picked up the receiver and dialed an internal number. "Security," she said, her eyes locked on Victoria. "I need assistance at the main counter. We have a suspicious transaction in progress." The lobby went quiet. Completely quiet. The man with the newspaper set it down entirely. The woman with the expensive bag took out her phone and started recording. Others followed. Within seconds, 6 phones were pointed at the counter. A security guard appeared, a heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks. His hand rested near the radio on his belt. "Ma'am," Patricia said, and now her voice carried the full weight of authority. The authority of someone who believed they were protecting the bank from a criminal. "I'm going to ask you to step aside while we investigate this matter." "I have the right to complete my transaction," Victoria said quietly. "You have the right to be detained for attempted fraud if this check turns out to be fake." "Have you called the issuing bank?" "I don't need to call anyone." Patricia's voice had an edge now, sharp and certain. "I know what I'm looking at. And what I'm looking at is a woman who serves breakfast for a living, trying to cash a check worth more than she'll earn in 100 lifetimes." The silence in that lobby was absolute. Every eye was on them. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked satisfied, like they were watching justice being served. Nobody spoke up for Victoria. Not one person. Victoria looked at Patricia. She looked at the check in Patricia's hand. She looked at the security guard whose fingers had tightened around his radio. And she looked at David, the young teller, who had turned away, unable to meet her eyes. Then she made a choice. "I would like to speak with your supervisor," Victoria said. Patricia laughed. It was a short, harsh sound without any humor in it. "My supervisor isn't going to help you," she said. "No one in this bank is going to help you. Because we don't help people who try to steal from us." She held up the check. $10 million, written on legitimate paper, from a legitimate company, made out to a legitimate person. And she tore it in half. The sound echoed through the silent lobby. But Patricia wasn't finished. She tore the halves into quarters. Then she crumpled all the pieces in her fist and threw them at Victoria's chest. The fragments of paper scattered across the marble floor, coming to rest at Victoria's worn shoes. "Get out," Patricia said. "Get out before I have you arrested." Victoria didn't move. She looked down at the torn pieces of the check. She looked at Patricia, whose face was flushed with righteous anger. She looked at the security guard who had taken a step closer. She looked at the other customers, the men in suits, the women with their designer bags, all of them watching. All of them recording. None of them speaking. Victoria bent down slowly and picked up 2 of the torn pieces. She held them in her hands, looking at the fragments of numbers that had been printed there. Then she straightened and looked directly at Patricia. "I'm not leaving," she said. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Then I'm calling the police." "Call them." "You think I won't?" "I think you should," Victoria said, her voice calm and measured. "And while you're at it, I think you should consider how you're going to explain this. Not to the police. Not to your supervisor. But to yourself. How are you going to explain that you looked at a human being, decided what she was worth based on her clothes, and destroyed her property in front of witnesses?" Patricia opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, the front door of the bank opened. A man walked in. Older, distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of presence that made people instinctively stand up straighter. He wore a suit that cost more than most cars. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who owned everything he saw. Because he did. Alexander Sterling, chairman of the board of Sterling Trust Bank, had arrived for an unannounced inspection. Patricia's face transformed instantly. The anger vanished, replaced by a bright, professional smile. "Mr. Sterling," she said. "What a pleasant surprise. The branch is running smoothly, as always. We actually just prevented what appeared to be a fraud attempt." But Alexander Sterling wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the woman in the waitress uniform, the one with torn pieces of paper clutched in her hands. And his face had gone completely pale. He walked past Patricia like she didn't exist, past the security guard, past David, until he stood directly in front of Victoria. And then he said one word. "Sir." The lobby went absolutely still. Patricia's smile froze on her face. "Mr. Sterling," she said, confusion creeping into her voice. "I don't understand. This woman, This woman," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "is Victoria Lane. She is the CEO of Lane Capital Holdings. And she is the largest single shareholder of this bank." The silence that followed was the sound of a world breaking apart. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Victoria Lane, CEO, largest shareholder. Patricia Bennett stood frozen, her professional smile still carved into her face like a mask that had forgotten how to fall. Around her, the lobby had become a photograph. People mid-breath, phones still raised. Everyone suspended in the moment before everything changed. That's not possible," Patricia whispered. Her voice sounded strange, like it was coming from someone else. Alexander Sterling didn't look at her. His attention remained fixed on Victoria, and the expression on his face was something Patricia had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. "Mrs. Lane," he said, and every word was careful, measured, like a man walking across ice that was already cracking beneath his feet. "I had no idea you would be visiting us today. If I had known." "You would have what?" Victoria's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Rolled out the red carpet? Called ahead to warn your staff." Sterling's jaw tightened. "I would have ensured you received the service you deserve." "And what service does a waitress deserve, Mr. Sterling?" The question had no answer. Not one that anyone in that lobby could speak out loud. Victoria looked around the room. At the phone still recording. At the customers who wouldn't meet her eyes. At the security guard who had taken 2 steps backward, his hand no longer anywhere near his belt. At David, the young teller, whose face had gone the color of snow. And at Patricia, who looked like she might shatter into pieces right there on the marble floor. "Mr. Sterling," Patricia's voice cracked. "There must be some mistake. This woman came in wearing. She said she was a waitress. The check was for $10 million. I made an assessment based on the information available to me." "What information was that?" Victoria asked softly. Patricia's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. "Was it my uniform?" Victoria continued. "My shoes? The color of my skin? What exactly told you that I was a criminal?" I didn't. "You didn't verify the check," Sterling said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "You didn't call the issuing bank. You didn't run any standard procedures. You just tore it up." Patricia looked at the scattered pieces of paper on the floor. At the evidence of what she'd done, recorded on a dozen phones, witnessed by dozens of people. And for the first time, she seemed to understand the magnitude of her mistake. "If I weren't Victoria Lane," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "If I were exactly who you thought I was, just a waitress with a legitimate check, what would have happened to me?" Patricia's lips trembled. I was following my judgment. I was protecting the bank." "From what? From me?" Victoria took a step closer. "If she had walked in with the same check," she pointed to the woman with the designer bag, "would you have torn it up?" Patricia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew the truth. But this story didn't start in that lobby. It started 5 years earlier, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and dying flowers. Victoria Lane had sat beside her husband's bed, holding his hand. Thomas Lane. 20 years of marriage. 2 children. A $4 billion empire built from nothing. And it had all come down to this, a white room with machines that beeped out the rhythm of a failing heart. "I spent my whole life building something," Thomas had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We built it together. But I don't know if we ever really saw it." "Saw what?" Victoria had asked. "The world. The real one. the one where people have to fight just to be treated like human beings. Victoria had told him he was being morbid. They'd done good work, philanthropy, scholarships, community programs. They'd given back. But Thomas had shaken his head weakly. That's not the same thing. That's helping from above. I'm talking about being down there, in it. Knowing what it actually feels like. He died 3 weeks later. And Victoria, after the funeral, after the lawyers, after the endless parade of people who wanted something from the widow of Thomas Lane, made a decision. She sold their mansion. She moved to a small apartment in Brooklyn. She stopped attending galas and board meetings. She found a job at Rosie's Diner, working for a woman named Dorothy who didn't ask questions and didn't care about resumes. For 5 years, Victoria Lane became invisible. She learned what it meant to be followed in stores by security guards who assumed she was stealing. She learned what it meant to stand on street corners while taxis passed her by, only to stop for white passengers half a block down. She learned what it meant to walk into restaurants and be seated near the kitchen while white customers in jeans got the window tables. She kept a mental catalog of these moments, each one a small cut, each one a lesson about the world her husband had asked her to see. And now, standing in the lobby of a bank she partially owned, holding torn pieces of a $10 million check, Victoria understood something with perfect clarity. Her husband had been right. She had never really seen it before. But she saw it now. "Mrs. Lane," Sterling said, and there was pleading in his voice now. "Please, let's discuss this in private. I have a conference room upstairs. We can resolve this quietly, discreetly. Whatever you want, compensation, a public apology, structural changes, we can discuss all of it." "No," Victoria said quietly. "No, no," she repeated. "I've spent 5 years living quietly, Mr. Sterling. 5 years trying to understand something my husband asked me before he died. And I learned." She looked around the lobby again. "I learned that the world judges people by what they wear, where they work, the color of their skin. I learned that dignity is something you have to fight for. And I learned that most people don't have the weapons to fight with." She held up the torn pieces of the check. "But I do." Sterling's face went pale. "Mrs. Lane, think about what you're saying. The media attention, the exposure, the truth?" Victoria finished for him. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. I'm thinking about the truth. And here's what I want. Not compensation. Not a quiet settlement. I want a full investigation. Not just of Mrs. Bennett, but of this entire bank. The patterns. The policies. The unwritten rules that told her she could look at me and know that I didn't belong here." "Please," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "Please, I have a family. I have 2 children." Victoria turned to look at her. Really look at her. "So do I," Victoria said softly. "And so does the next woman you would have done this to. And the next. And the next." Sterling closed his eyes. He was a practical man. He'd built his career on knowing when to cut losses. And he knew, looking at Victoria Lane, that this was not a fight he could win. "An investigation," he said slowly. "You understand what that would mean? The board will. The board will do what I tell them to do," Victoria said, and her voice carried a quiet authority that reminded everyone exactly who she was. "I own 35% of this bank, Mr. Sterling. I have been a silent partner for 15 years. But I am not silent anymore." She turned to face the lobby. The phones. The witnesses. The security guard who wished he could disappear. "Everything that happened here today is documented," she said. "The question now is not whether this story gets out. The question is what kind of story it becomes. You can make it a story about a bank that made a mistake and tried to bury it. Or you can make it a story about a bank that made a mistake and decided to change." The video hit the internet before Victoria even made it home. By evening, it had been viewed 2 million times. By morning, that number had grown to 8 million. The footage was shaky, captured from multiple angles, but the story was clear. A black woman in a waitress uniform, standing calm while a bank manager tore up her check and threw it at her chest. The internet did what it does. Within 48 hours, people had identified Patricia Bennett, found her social media, her children's school. Every detail of her life spread across forums with the gleeful cruelty of a mob that believed itself righteous. But then came the second wave. The revelation that the woman in the video wasn't just a waitress. She was Victoria Lane, CEO, billionaire, one of the wealthiest black women in America. The story exploded. 3 months later, Victoria sat in a congressional hearing room packed with reporters and cameras. She wore a simple navy dress, The first time in 5 years she'd dressed like the woman she used to be. Patricia Bennett sat at a separate table, flanked by lawyers, looking smaller somehow. Diminished. The questions came fast. Did you verify the check? No. Did you contact the issuing bank? No. If a white man in a business suit had presented the same check, would you have torn it up? Patricia's lawyers whispered urgently, but she waved them off. When she spoke, her voice cracked with something that sounded almost like relief. No, she said. I wouldn't have. The room erupted. Then it was Victoria's turn. People have asked me why I did this, she said. Why I didn't just accept a private settlement and move on. Why I subjected myself to this scrutiny when I had spent 5 years trying to be invisible. She looked out at the room. At the reporters. At the cameras. At Patricia sitting with her head bowed. The answer is simple. I did it because I could. Because I had the resources and the platform to make sure this story was heard. Most people who experience what I experienced don't have those things. They get humiliated, and then they go home and nothing changes. She turned to Patricia. Mrs. Bennett, I don't hate you. I don't even blame you. Not entirely. You were operating within a system that taught you to look at people like me and see a threat. That system failed both of us. The difference is that I had the power to fight back. And you didn't have the power to see me clearly. Patricia looked up, her eyes red and hollow. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I am so sorry. Victoria nodded slowly. I know you are. And I hope that when this is over, you'll use that sorrow to become someone different. The hearing concluded with $50 million in fines and sweeping reforms. Patricia Bennett resigned 6 months later, not because she was forced to, but because, as she wrote in her resignation letter, I no longer trust my own judgment. David Chun, the young teller who had frozen that day, eventually became head of customer experience training. He kept a newspaper clipping on his desk from the day of the hearing. Underneath it, he'd written, You never know who you're looking at. But the final scene of this story happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon, 6 months after everything had changed. Victoria walked into a small community bank 3 blocks from her Brooklyn apartment. She was wearing her Rosie's Diner uniform, having just finished the lunch shift. Same worn shoes. Same simple bun. She approached the counter and placed a check in front of the teller. A young black woman with natural hair and a warm smile. I'd like to deposit this, please, Victoria said. The teller picked up the check. $500. Tip money saved over weeks. Of course, ma'am, she said. She processed the transaction quickly, efficiently, then looked up with a genuine smile. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Victoria looked at her. At this young woman who had asked no questions about her appearance, who had made no assumptions about who she was or what she deserved, who had simply treated her like a human being. No, Victoria said softly. That's everything. Thank you. She walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk, feeling the spring sunshine on her face. The street was busy with ordinary life. Mothers pushing strollers, teenagers laughing, an old man walking his dog. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody knew her name. She was just another woman in a uniform, going about her day. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like exactly what she wanted to be. Her husband had asked her, all those years ago, if she knew how the world would treat her without the money and the name. She had spent 5 years finding out. The answer had been painful, brutal, heartbreaking. But standing on that Brooklyn sidewalk, watching ordinary life unfold around her, Victoria realized something else. The world wasn't fixed. It wasn't perfect. But it could be changed. Not by being rich. Not by being powerful. But by being willing to stand in a marble lobby and refuse to leave. By being willing to say, I'm not going anywhere. Respect shouldn't be something you earn by revealing your bank balance. It should be the baseline, the starting point, the minimum standard of how we treat each other. Victoria had spent 5 years learning that lesson. And now maybe a few more people had learned it too. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed down her apron, and walked home. Tomorrow, she would be back at Rosie's Diner, serving breakfast to strangers who would never know her story. And that was exactly as it should be. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, made you think, or stayed with you even for a moment, that means everything. Stories like this remind us that dignity isn't negotiable, and respect isn't something we should have to earn. Before you go, ask yourself, what would you have done in that lobby? Would you have been one of the people recording in silence? Or would you have been the one to speak up? Remember, You never know who you're looking at. But more importantly, you shouldn't have to. Until next time, take care of yourself. And treat everyone with the dignity they deserve. Not because of who they might be, but because of who you choose to be.